Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Vancouver, Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to stand in support of this motion today that the Government of Canada, in consultation with the provinces and territories, should take immediate steps towards abolishing the unelected and unaccountable Senate of Canada. I want to start by talking about the original formation of the Senate. You know, there's this phrase that the older we get, the better we were, and I think that applies to the Senate. There's a lot of romanticism about what this chamber is today and what it was intended to be, but there's different schools of thought on that. And my reading in law school and otherwise in the student political science department at the University of Alberta some time ago left me with a distinct impression of some of the less attractive aspects of the Senate when it was envisioned by the founders of this country. First of all, the Senate was envisioned as a bastion of protection for the propertied and elite classes of this country. The propertied classes had a fear of majoritarian democratic view at that time. At that time, of course, the concept of having directly elected legislatures where the people of a country or a state would directly elect their legislators was new, and there was great fear, particularly by the classes that represented the nobility or the moneyed classes of that direction. That's why in our Constitution to this day we have a requirement that you must own $4,000 worth of property in order to even sit in the Senate. Right off the bat, that disenfranchises millions of Canadians in this country who, by their own Constitution, cannot take a seat in the Senate because they don't own a piece of property. In addition, there was a fear of majoritarian rule and democracy. There were people who wanted to sit in the Senate and keep watch over what democratically elected officials would do in this chamber here. And so let's burst through some of that romanticism and recognize that the chamber has a very ignoble beginning, not one of sober second thought or of such lofty ideals, but one of a fear of democracy, entrenchment of propertied classes, and rejection of the idea of majoritarian rule in this country. Now, I want to move to sober second thought because I've heard a lot of comment on that today. I can tell you any concept that the Senate chamber stands today as a chamber of sober second thought was burst 2 years ago when this House here passed by democratic vote the climate change bill that then went over to the Senate, where the senators who were unelected and unaccountable to Canadians voted against that bill without any real substantive debate. There was no sober second thought of that bill, leaving aside the affront to democracy that a bunch of fundraisers and failed candidates who do not have any mandate from the Canadian people to pass judgment on legislation ended up overriding the democratically elected decision of the people in this chamber who do have a mandate from the Canadian public. So not only was it undemocratic, Mr. Speaker, but my main point is that there was no deliberation done whatsoever. It was orders from the PMO that went into the Senate, and they killed that bill for political reasons. So let's disabuse ourselves of any notion that that chamber stands as any chamber of sober second thought in this country. I want to talk a little bit about democracy. I've heard my Liberal colleagues say, well, the economy is on people's mind. Why are we wasting time talking about the Senate? Well, with respect, I think Canadians are concerned about their democracy. I think Canadians are concerned about the institutions of government in their country. And to make that a second-rate concern of Canadians and try to make a hierarchy, I think is unbecoming. We are a democracy in this country, and I think Canadians are proud that we live in a democratic structure. And whenever any parliamentarian or any Canadian wants to talk about improving the democracy in this country, that is an issue of first-order importance to the New Democrats, not an order of second-order importance to Liberals, which is maybe why the Liberals never did anything to reform the Senate in their time in office. Now, I want to talk about the concept of electing senators, because there's been some talk about that. Well, of course, we have a problem with the Canadian structure if we actually have two chambers in this country that each claim democratic legitimacy, because it wasn't set up that way, Mr. Speaker. The Senate was set up with certain powers. On paper, they have the power to stop legislation, but senators have always recognized that because they have no democratic legitimacy, they do not have the ability to stop legislation that comes from the House of Commons. On rare occasions in the history of Canada, the Senate has overridden legislation like we saw on the climate change bill or we saw on abortion legislation at some time. But generally, at least senators have had the recognition that they have no right to override legislation in this House. If you elect those senators and they feel that they do have a mandate, what happens if you have a new Democrat-controlled House or a Liberal-controlled House and a Conservative-controlled Senate? What happens if you have gridlock? Because that's exactly what you have. We're not like the United States, Mr. Speaker, where they have a carefully crafted system where they have an executive branch of government that can often override the problems of having a stalemate, but we also see in the United States and other countries where you do have such stalemate. So keeping a Senate and electing them actually would lead to further gridlock in this country. Now, in terms of election, I keep hearing the Conservatives particularly say, well, senators don't represent provinces, they represent regions, that the Senate is about regional representation, not provincial representation. And of course they say that because one of the problems with the representation in the Senate is that it's unequal. I've pointed out several times today that British Columbia, with 40 times the population of Prince Edward Island, has 6 senators and PEI has 4. So we have provincial imbalance. So that's why the Conservatives then switch and say, well, it's not about provincial representation, it's about regional representation. If that's the case, why are the elections that the Conservatives are pledging provincial elections? Why aren't they regional elections? How can a person be elected to represent the region of the West but only be elected in Alberta? That disenfranchises the rest of the people in the so-called region that they're claiming those people represent. What it shows, Mr. Speaker, is the absolute hollowness and lack of thought that's going into some of the comments being made today by the Conservative side of this House, because it has nothing to do with regional representation. It has nothing to do with provincial representation. It has to do with an unelected chamber that has no democratic legitimacy to anybody making decisions in government, and that has no place in a modern democracy in 2013. Now, I also want to talk, Mr. Speaker, a little bit about hope. You know, any country should be able to look at its constitution and be able to improve it. A constitution is a living, breathing document. The United States has amended their constitution some 20 times. Yet in Canada, we haven't amended our constitution once since we repatriated it in 1980. And in fact, the repatriation of our constitution and the establishment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was a sign that we can, as a country, make progressive democratic changes to our nation. And we in the New Democrats think we can do that. We think that we can think big. We can think of possibilities. We can think of improving our democracy. Yes, it will require a constitutional amendment of some type, most likely. But if all constitutional changes will require that. Even the ones the Conservatives are proposing will require a constitutional amendment. If we talk about electing the Senate or changing in some way its powers, we're going to have to talk about amending our Constitution. And I, for my part, believe that Canadians are ready to do that. We can look at our Constitution and update it just like the Americans have done to theirs or many other people do to theirs as well. I want to talk just a little bit more about cost. I hear this number that the Senate costs $90 million a year. Actually, Mr. Speaker, it's much more than that. $90 million is the amount in the estimates that goes in terms of the actual running of the Senate. When you add up travel bills and staffing costs, you're actually more than $150 million a year. And I would say, Mr. Speaker, that today, when you're talking about $1/8 billion, Canadians would rather see that money spent on many other things than on partisan-appointed senators who don't have constituencies, who don't have any accountability to the people of Canada, yet have the ability on paper to make legislation. Mr. Speaker, all people in this House, all members of this House, I believe, want to improve democracy. I think we're all well-intentioned. We may have different paths on how we get there. But what is important is we should not shy away from discussing fundamental issues of democracy and ways that we can improve it. We see people in Syria today who are fighting for responsible government. All over the world they're doing that. Surely we can have a mature discussion in this country about ways to improve our democracy and ways to make it more accountable to Canadians. So we can start, Mr. Speaker, by abolishing any structure like 4 provinces have done in this country without any diminution in their ability to govern, including Quebec and Ontario, when those institutions are not democratically chosen by the people of this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.